You were on Oprah at 10 years old.
I was 8.
8 years old?
Yeah. My dad had moved to LA with me because I had just won a job in the Los Angeles Philharmonic. When I saw Skid Row for the first time, it's probably what everyone sees, which is trash and neglect. And what you're realizing is that you're seeing people's homes. I was seeing my future. Right. This music that Beethoven wrote at the hardest moment of his life, that belongs amongst people who are living the hardest time of their life. Not only among people who are able to pay $300 a night for it.
Wow, wow, wow. I don't think you get any higher than lead violinist at the LA Philharmonic. You're wanting to play mental hospitals?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
And the first time I went to the state hospital, I played this epic 15-minute long piece of Bach for this audience. And dude, I didn't invite them into the music. I just kind of played at them, expecting that they were going to hear how fucking awesome I was. And no one applauded. This man stood up in the middle of the room and he said, "Son, don't you know any songs we know?" But what the man was really saying was, "Do you see me? Am I invisible to you?" In Skid Row, art is constantly redefined because survival is an art form.
Ooh.
Homelessness is fundamentally an epidemic of spiritual alienation.
Wow.
On the Jungian...
I'm saying wow a lot, but that's a big one.
Skid Row is the shadow side of Hollywood. Hollywood is the glitz and the glamour and the pretend.
Right.
Skid Row is the shadow reality.
Wow.
It's the same delusion. It's the same performance. Except Skid Row's real.
Vijay joined the LA Philharmonic at 19 years old. He is a childhood prodigy with perfect pitch, went to Juilliard, I mean, all the stuff, right? And at the top of his career, he walked away to start Street Symphony, which brings classical music to homeless people on Skid Row. Vijay explains not only about his life, why he wrote a book, why he dedicated it to his father, but more importantly, Vijay's outlook on Skid Row, specifically homeless people in Skid Row. You need to watch and listen to this podcast. Vijay, I was thinking last night, when was the last time I heard you play? And it was at the Midnight Mission, and you had me speak.
Yeah.
It was a huge honor, not just that you invited me to speak about homelessness and recovery to a bunch of people at the Midnight Mission, many of them still experiencing homelessness, but speaking to a bunch of people who I might hopefully be able to say something that could possibly change their life. So it is a memory that I will always cherish.
I'll never forget that.
And I have to say sorry about the delay. People might wonder why I have gauze on my head. Well, I was in a hurry and I was trying to get some clean socks. And as I was rushing, I hit my head on the dryer door and it's been leaking, but I made it and the show must go on. So how have you been?
Good. Good. It's really an honor to see you. And I'm so grateful for the role that you've played, you know, the role that you played in my life. When we met, I was organizing a conference in Skid Row of people who have had a massive impact on not just telling the stories of people recovering from homelessness and incarceration and addiction. But, you know, you were one of the first people who helped me see that Skid Row is one of the country's largest reentry zones.
Wow.
And that the conversation that we need to be having about places like Skid Row or encampments like where we are right now in Long Beach is that these are places, these are like nexuses of care. And compassion and humanity. And we have so much to learn from the way that people are literally living out their most creative act.
Can you unpack that a little more? Because So often people look at Skid Row or an encampment, they don't see care.
Yeah. The first time I ever drove through Skid Row was when I was 19 years old and I was learning how to drive. I was in Los Angeles because my dad had moved to LA with me because I had just won a job in the Los Angeles Philharmonic. And, my dad was sort of this terrifying figure in the car yelling at me, and all I did was take right turns instead of left turns. So I was just driving down San Pedro Street. And the thing that I saw when I saw Skid Row for the first time is probably what everyone sees, which is trash and neglect. And what you're realizing is that you're seeing people's homes.
Yeah.
And I was overwhelmed with this feeling of shame and guilt and disgust. And it was disgust both outward,
Yeah.
what I was seeing,
Yeah.
and it was also disgust inward for me because my parents had wanted me to be the other Dr. Gupta.
Yeah.
Right? And when I saw Skid Row for the first time, what I was asking is, well, what on earth is my role in the world as a world-class violinist playing on stage a mile away
Right.
from the largest homeless encampment in Los Angeles County? So I spent the last 18 years asking this question.
Yeah.
But I think what we often stop at is the externalizing of our own pain, right? When we see our own pain manifested in another human being. When I started playing at the Midnight Mission, that was around 2011, 2012, and I was at the time a member of the LA Philharmonic, and the mode of my operation then was the charity outreach concert,
Yeah.
meaning bullshit. I was coming in with this idea that I was this healed, expert, know-it-all do-gooder.
Yeah.
Coming in to heal and help people through music. I have a friend who calls this drive-by Beethoven, right? That we're gonna come play some Beethoven for poor black and brown people living in Skid Row, and they'll be better for it.
Yeah.
And what I started to notice very early on, the person who ran the Music with the Mission program at the Midnight Mission, who's still the chief communications officer of the Midnight Mission, is Georgia Berkovich.
Yeah.
And Georgia would say to me, our whole hope here is to leave someone with a moment of sweetness.
I like that.
And moments of sweetness are also moments where someone is able to feel that sweetness again, to feel that dignity again.
Yeah.
So when you came and spoke, people weren't just seeing entertainment. They were having their soul nourished, right? They were actually seeing
my gosh.
that someone who has walked what we have walked through, someone who might have also lived the worst day of their life, the way that we're living the worst day of our life right now, survived.
Yeah.
And I got to witness that transaction happen. And it wasn't a transaction of money, it was a transaction of humanity.
Yeah. Yeah. We first met, you had an event on Skid Row, not just any event, it was a TEDx on Skid Row.
Yeah. Yeah. The truth is, Mark, I wish I hadn't done that TEDx.
Really?
Because I wish I had just been brave enough to ask, will you be my friend?
Interesting.
That's actually all I wanted. I thought at that time that I had to perform putting on conferences and being this curator and this big person and this kind of show-off know-it-all because I had this double-edged sort of label put on me as a kid, which is that I was a prodigy.
Yeah.
And for all the sort of external definitions of prodigy, started going to college when I was 13, went to a second college when I was 15, joined the LA Phil when I was 19 after I got a master's from Yale, did an undergraduate in bio pre-med. The issue is that all these accomplishments and accolades just kept me feeling more and more and more like a fraud. Because the thing about being called a prodigy is that every single thing you do is being judged against that label.
Right.
So anything that is not prodigious, i.e., human, normal, flawed, broken, imperfect, means that you're an imposter in your own skin. And so the thing is that all I wanted was to learn from you.
From me?
Yes, of course, from you.
From me?
I wanted to learn from you. I wanted to learn from John Malpete. I wanted to learn from Homeboy Industries. I wanted to learn from this world-class ecosystem of care that is Skid Row.
Yeah.
And you came and you gave this amazing talk And for years I've wondered, was I just kind of extracting something from you? Was I just kind of taking more than I was giving? And it's this kind of thing where, you begin to realize that the way that you've been used and packaged as a kid is the way that you start to use and package other people.
Yeah.
And so I was so grateful to you for coming in and indulging my naive, childish bullshit fucking TEDx.
Well, I thought it was a great event.
We worked hard. We certainly worked hard.
But it's really interesting that you talk about how your default was you felt you needed to perform.
Yeah.
I can understand that. I can even understand that now because I have a hat. So, the show must go on.
Yeah.
I don't have, my background is music too, but not nearly. You were on Oprah at 10 years old.
I was 8.
8 years old.
Yeah.
That's a lot for a young kid.
Yeah.
And it shapes as you grow older.
Yeah.
And you write about this in the book, the LA Philharmonic, and how you changed over time.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
So when I was a little kid, I started playing the violin when I was 4 years old. And my first violin was made by my dad out of a Cracker Jack box and a ruler because I was such a rambunctious, destructive, break everything little boy. And all I would do is I'd follow him around like screaming Paul Simon Graceland at the top of my lungs. And he was just like, I got to do something about this kid. Because he was a travel agent. He was working from home. He ran his whole business. And so I would just like cling to him all day long and just rub away on this Cracker Jack violin.
Yeah.
And then later on, when my dad realized that I had perfect pitch and that I could hear a song once and just kind of spout it back out, I started taking violin lessons. And then my dad realized that, maybe I was super talented, maybe I was prodigious. He started writing to famous people as me. And so he wrote to David Letterman and Oprah and Sally Jesse Raphael. And some of these shows had me on, and it was this kind of thing where very quickly I learned how to always be watching behind the camera, behind the host, sometimes behind the conductor when I started playing as a soloist to watch for my dad.
Yeah.
Because he was the only person who mattered.
Wow.
He was the only person I couldn't let down.
Right.
And so what I realize now is that I, as a child, was so lucky because my dad sacrificed so much for me and my little brother to go to places like Juilliard and to study, classical music. But at the same time, my brother and I sacrificed our childhoods to never let our parents down.
Yeah.
And this is very much part of the immigrant life. My parents were both immigrants from Bengal. They came here, my dad worked baggage claim at JFK. But at the same time, later on, it kind of imbued for me that I always had to be performing to not let somebody down.
Yeah.
And so then when I got to the LA Philharmonic when I was 19 years old, the next youngest person in my section, the first violin section, was 45 years old, right? So I was 19 going on 45.
Wow.
And maybe there were a couple of people who were like in their 30s, but they didn't want to hang out with me.
Right.
And no one really wanted to hang out with me. So I just started hanging out with the weirdos in the orchestra, the people who were willing to love a 19-year-old who either became like my surrogate parents or they were people who had their own wounds and their own demons. And now I suddenly had 108 other people to never let down. Right. So the truth is that, for me as a 19-year-old, music had never been a job. Music was this all-consuming, pure love, passion, light, joy, the only source of love, unconditional love in my life was music. Yeah. And now suddenly the music was a job. And I felt like I was betraying the music and I felt like the music had betrayed me. And so then when I started cold calling shelters and clinics and county jails and VAs, not knowing what I was looking for, what I was actually looking for is people who were going to listen to me with love.
Yeah.
And that's what I found for the first time in these places.
Oh my gosh, so many. I want to, you start off in the book talking about you playing at a state hospital and there was no applause.
Yeah.
And somebody started singing.
Yeah.
So I got to ask you about that. But what you're just talking about, how did that change happen? Mm-hmm. Like, you're in high society, Los Angeles.
Yep.
I don't think you get any higher than lead violinist at the LA Philharmonic, right?
Yeah.
And you're wanting to play mental hospitals?
Yeah.
How did that happen?
So, yeah, you're right. On any given night, I was playing for 18,000 people at the Hollywood Bowl with John Williams, the composer who wrote the Darth Vader theme, on the podium, like 6 feet away from me. And there's 18,000 people in the audience of the Hollywood Bowl screaming and waving lightsabers. I mean, it was the headiest rush.
Right.
And I'm like, that was the day I turned 20.
Yeah. Hollywood Bowl in itself
Right.
must be a thrill. But the lightsabers, on top of that, Star Wars?
Adrenaline motherload.
Right.
Right. And, you know, look, I have been a classical music nerd my entire life, right? There was a time where I used to stand in my dorm room at school and conduct Brahms to myself and cry, weep, pray to God that I would be able to play this music one day, because that music was so sacred and so powerful, and all I wanted was to share it. And so, you know, on the nights where we would play Brahms at the Hollywood Bowl, people would be sitting in the front row who had paid maybe $1,000 for their ticket, you know, and they'd be eating ribeyes, and they'd be drinking Malbec, and they'd be talking the entire concert. And I began to realize that, oh, I'm the entertainment. You know, this is actually not about the sacred. This is not about delivering that soul connection. Now, don't get me wrong. There were moments at the LA Philharmonic, at Disney Hall, when we were on tour, that were transcendent and beautiful and wonderful. And I was fundamentally a cog in the entertainment mass industrial complex.
Right.
That was my job.
Right.
And so there was something I knew that was missing. I just didn't know what it was. And when I started going to college when I was 13 years old, my major was biology pre-med, because I'm an Indian kid whose last name is Gupta, so my parents needed me to be the other Dr. Gupta. I had spent some time in neuroscience labs. I had actually understood the way that music affected the brain. And so there was also this question in my mind, could music be medicine?
Wow.
And so that's when I started cold calling shelters and clinics. It's the first time I saw Skid Row. And when I saw Skid Row for the first time, there was actually a Beethoven string quartet playing in my car the time that I was driving down Skid Row. And that
was your first time,
That was my first time. My dad was in the passenger seat screaming at me, you know, to get us the fuck out of here.
Right.
Right. You know, how could you make the wrong turn that got us into the middle of the largest homeless community in Los Angeles, which is less than a mile away from Walt Disney Concert Hall, by the way.
Right.
And I think what my dad was seeing was a poverty he had tried his whole life to escape.
Wow.
And I was seeing my future.
Right.
Because all I could feel in that moment was, I have to make this music here. Yeah. I don't know why, but this music that Beethoven wrote at the hardest moment of his life, that belongs amongst people who are living the hardest time of their life. Yeah. Not only among people who are able to pay $300 a night for it. Right. Where does Beethoven belong? Yeah. And so when I started cold calling shelters and clinics, though, I wasn't ready for the humiliation of showing up thinking I was the expert. I used to dress in all black, wear patent leather shoes, you know, dress up like for a concert. And the first time I went to the Patton State Hospital in San Bernardino, I played this epic 15-minute long piece of Bach for this audience. And dude, I just played at them. I didn't invite them into the music. I didn't care to explain what I was playing. I just kind of played at them, expecting that they were going to hear how fucking awesome I was. Right? And no one applauded at the end of it. There was the first time in my life, since playing the violin since I was 4 years old, that I had bombed. No one applauded.
Well, it felt like you had bombed.
Well, I mean, then this man, this inmate, stood up in the middle of the room and he said, "Son, don't you know any songs we know?" And I just blanked. And then he started singing Jesus on the Main Line.
Wow.
And other inmates in the state hospital started singing with him.
Wow.
And they started tapping their feet and they started clapping along. And I realized that this man had done what everyone had expected me to do, which wasn't just to sing a song they all knew, but what the man was really saying was, do you see me? Am I invisible to you?
Right.
And we have this phrase. I grew up in the Hindu tradition. And in Sanskrit, we have this word called darshan. And darshan can be the way that we see each other.
Right.
Darshan is, I see you, you see me. But darshan is also the seeing beyond seeing. I see the divine in you. Right? And you see the divine in me. That's what namaste really means, is I acknowledge the divine that's in you. So we are walking around invisible to each other.
Yeah. We all have masks on too.
And we are actively hiding from each other. And the truth is, when I went to Skid Row for the first time, people saw through my mask. The first time I was ever not invisible to the world was in Skid Row.
Wow.
And it was people in Skid Row who saw me and saw through me.
Right.
And were saying, hey, it's good that you're coming here to walk your steps.
Yeah.
And I'd say, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, I'm here to heal you. I'm here to help you. I'm the great musician. I'm the Juilliard-trained motherfucker who's here to deliver something to you.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, honey, it's so good that you're coming to walk your steps.
Wow. As homelessness grows, people are getting frustrated and they're pushing for laws that criminalize homelessness, which will only make the problem worse. Invisible People reaches more people, educating them on homelessness than all other homeless sector nonprofits and campaigns combined. But we do it on a limited budget. We don't have the funding they do. We are mostly funded by individual donations. And now that the economy is struggling, individual donations are disappearing, and we need you. I get it. You might not have the money to donate. Many people are struggling right now. Please share our content, share our videos. It really matters. And if you do have some funds and want to help be part of the solution to solve homelessness, please visit invisiblepeople.tv/donate. Our important work stops without you. Wow, wow, wow. When I walk into Skid Row, the first feeling that's overwhelming, to me anyways, is if I stop being affected by what I'm seeing, what I'm smelling, what I'm hearing, then I'm no longer human. Because what is going on, or the state of people, the state of human beings on Skid Row are often so low that the day that doesn't affect me is the day that I have to stop working to prevent and solve homelessness. And I hope that day doesn't happen. I mean, it comes with a lot of pain. It comes with a lot of, your empathy is squeezed, right? So I hope. But it's so interesting that you went down there, and it brings up, Skid Row, there's a community there. There's a lot of joy, and there's a lot of wonderful, beautiful things that happen on Skid Row. But one of the things that I just love about homeless people, and there are many, is that the tolerance. So you would have, let's say you go to a park and there's a group of homeless people, and there'd be somebody in a wheelchair, and there's different races and different sexual orientations and mental illness and addiction. And it's not perfect, but nothing in life is perfect. And they're all in community. And there's tolerance for the difference in each person. If you went to the board of some Fortune 500 company, it's mostly white males who have no tolerance for people that are not like them. So I find that to be gorgeous. I find there's also, which you're talking about, there's like homeless people will tell you like it is. Yeah. They have a no bullshit meter, and they'll tell you what's going on.
That's right. A couple of things are coming up for me. I'll indict myself for a moment, which is that I'm lucky enough to live in an amazing community. that was recently devastated by the fires that happened last January. And the only time I introduced myself to my neighbors was when we all came back and were so grateful that our homes were still standing. Yeah. That's when I learned my neighbors' names.
There's a saying here in Los Angeles is you meet your neighbors when there's an earthquake.
That's the first time. Yeah. And I don't know that I have gone out of my way to say thank you or say I love you or say thank you for coming back and hosing down this block so that my home is still standing, right? And yet in Skid Row, when we talk about what happened during COVID, more people died of accidental overdoses behind closed doors during COVID than of COVID on the streets. And the first thing that happened in Skid Row is that people living on the streets in Skid Row set up hand washing stations. Right? And so people know how to look out for each other. Homelessness is fundamentally an epidemic of spiritual alienation. It's an epidemic of apathy. I have met more people who do not have homes, who live in mansions in Beverly Hills and Bel Air, than I have who are people who live in tents or who live on a tarp, under a tarp, or are sleeping on the sidewalk themselves. They have more of a home than people who live in those mansions. Yeah. Right? And I have lived this life of literally stringing and restringing myself between the cognitive dissonance of Skid Row and Walt Disney Concert Hall, but also Skid Row and Bel Air and Beverly Hills and South Pasadena and the Pacific Palisades and Malibu. The place where I feel warmth and connection and joy, even amidst the despair, is Skid Row, right? So ultimately, I think that when I come to Skid Row now, I feel the same way you do. I cannot drive through Skid Row, even when I'm visiting the Mission, as I do several times a week, and not cry when I'm driving down San Pedro Street. And I hope I never lose that sense of compassion. And at the same time, what I feel is a sense of warmth, because some of my best friends live at the Midnight Mission. Yeah. Some of the best music I've ever made my entire life has happened at 6th and San Pedro. Wow.
So let's transition to Nathaniel Ayers. And I think you're going to... There was, The Soloist. I love the story. I hate the movie. But there was a documentary made at the same time. Lost Angels, Skid Row is my home. Right. And I love that movie. Yeah. First off, the crew was actually scared of Skid Row. Yeah. And then they started meeting people. Right. So they started filming this documentary at the same time they're filming The Soloist.
It was all the B-roll.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And there's and they didn't just show, I don't want to say the negative, but they didn't just show the crisis of Skid Row. They showed the beauty of community. Yeah. And like there's the one scene with Bam Bam who had two tents in his living room, right? And they asked him, why do you have 2 tents? And it was like, well, in case I have a friend over. So he now has an apartment, but he has a tent in his living room, 2 tents, because he's been outside so long, and we forget that. Anyways, I think that's a good transition to Nathaniel Ayers, and it's just, I love that movie because it doesn't just, you cry, but your heart is also warmed because Skid Row is not just the stereotypical. Yeah. It's also a community that there are people that are doing the best they can and they are taking care of their neighbors.
I think that we think about art in the wrong way. Art is not a noun. Art is a verb. It's the intention of human connection. Okay. And in Skid Row, art is constantly redefined because survival is an art form. Ooh. People are continuously, ingeniously reinventing themselves, right? There was a Desert Storm combat veteran I met many years ago who was also an amazing tenor. Okay. And he said to me, Skid Row is the end of the line. It's where people come to die. but Skid Row is also the beginning of a new life, right? And so the thing is that people's will to survive, their will to create community, their will to connect is the same impulse as the creative act itself. So when someone is actually, when you drive down Skid Row, you actually will see, mannequins decorated with feather boas. There's an artist in Skid Row named Skid Robot.
Yes.
Who will spray paint these amazing scenes of this is what I dream I could have.
Yeah. He spray paints, he calls it living art.
Yes.
Because there's a homeless person there, and then he spray paints on the wall behind them like a living room.
Yeah, that's right. And so it's also to say someone's imagination is actually set free in Skid Row, And so you also have this interdependent community that is looking out for each other, that is dependent on each other for their survival. So I actually think that if we want to understand what true love looks like, if we want to understand what universal healthcare might look like, we might see what it looks like at the Wesley Clinic or at the Midnight Mission or even among the community outside the big nonprofits that are taking care of each other on the street.
Yeah.
And that is not divorced or separate from the very same creative act. Because every year in Skid Row, we do a sing-along of a piece of music written by George Friedrich Handel. Now, he's one of those dead old white guys who's got the big marble bust, the jowly German dude with the wig and the blah, 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 all the stuff, right? It's one of the most chronically overperformed.
Not white guy, though.
Please, let's never hope that there's a marble bust of me, right? Only if it bleeds, right?
I can help with that.
Yeah, fantastic. Just a quick story that Handel was a Baroque rock star. In the 1730s, he was the shit, right? He was this German dude writing Italian opera, living in London. He has his own production company. He was one of the most famous musicians in the world. By the 1740s, he had a stroke. He was so broke, he was facing debtor's prison. He had been canceled. His right side was paralyzed. And he had basically written his resignation letter from London. He was leaving. And he'd moved to Dublin, broke. And then he was asked to write this oratorio called Messiah. And the first performance was performed in London as a benefit concert for a number of charities. The first performance of Messiah freed 142 men from debtor's prison.
Wow.
And he was the 143rd.
Wow.
He paid off his own debts. And then when he came back to London, he said, this music is going to be performed at an orphan's hospital. And every single year for the rest of his life, until he died, I think around 1752, I think he died, he performed that piece. He led the orphans.
Yeah.
Right? And he's the one who brought all the princes and the kings and the famous people to that place through his music. Right. And now we're playing Messiah in a concert hall as a benefit? Why? It should be in Skid Row. That is the place where so much of this music emerged from. So now when people in Skid Row either sing their own songs that they create in relation to Messiah, or when they sing The People Who Walked in Darkness Have Seen a Great Light, people in Skid Row sing with more conviction than any Juilliard-trained artist because they have walked that darkness and they have seen that great light.
Right. The passion is there. The passion is in their soul.
They have lived it.
And they're able to transmit that through art.
They have lived it. Right. And in my mind, that's what real art is.
Yeah.
Art is that ability to transform. And the kind of love that I received in Skid Row transformed me.
Yeah. So how did you first meet Nathaniel? How did that come about?
So at the time, I was the youngest violinist to ever have joined the LA Philharmonic. And the great, great writer, Steve Lopez, was writing a series of columns about Nathaniel. And a number of musicians in the LA Philharmonic actually became Nathaniel's friends because they had been to Juilliard with him. Even like Yo-Yo Ma had been at Juilliard with Nathaniel and remembered him because he was this unbelievable talent. And Nathaniel, in his junior year at Juilliard in the 1970s, started having schizophrenic hallucinations and was treated scare quotes, treated with shock therapy and Thorazine and handcuffs at Bellevue Hospital, and then had lived on the streets of LA for about 20 years at the time. And so I was actually myself being adopted by the very same musicians who were kind of adopting Nathaniel too.
Yeah.
And so the first time I ever really had a conversation with Nathaniel, and I write about this in the book, was at a bowling alley in Glendale. And he was celebrating his 57th birthday, except it wasn't his birthday. He was actually celebrating the birthday of his favorite composer, who was Ludwig van Beethoven.
Got it.
And that week, the LA Philharmonic had just performed a concert that was the program. I'll never forget. The program was Beethoven's First and Beethoven's Fourth Symphony. And Beethoven's Fourth Symphony is really complex, super difficult. The last movement is really, really virtuosic, constant 16ths, all the way through. Yeah. And in the bowling alley, Nathaniel cornered me, and he's like, "How do you do that? Like, what are you doing? How do you practice that? Like, how on earth are you able to do all that?" And he had been trained as a double bass player. In the movie, he's a cellist for some reason. Maybe Hollywood just thought the cello was a sexier instrument. Yeah. But he was actually a virtuoso double bass player. But he was so curious that I just pulled out my violin in the bowling alley. And I was there after an LA Phil concert. I had my violin, and I just started showing him. And then a couple of weeks later, Steve Lopez called me and said, "Well, Nathaniel wants a violin lesson from you at Walt Disney Concert Hall." Yeah. And so that was just our first lesson. And then Nathaniel and I just kept kind of running into each other. And sometimes I would see him pushing his shopping cart filled with instruments between Disney Hall, and sometimes he would set up his milk crates in the Second Street Tunnel to practice, because he liked the acoustics.
Right, you have the reverb, the echo there.
Exactly. And so sometimes I just pull over. Right. And I would just hop out and say hi. And that's when things started to really change for me, because the first question that came into my mind was, well, where's he going to sleep tonight? Yeah. And where's he going to get his next meal? And I just hugged that man. I just gave him a bunch of strings. Wait, where is he going? Right. And I started to get really curious, and then he started to invite me to his apartment. And he was living at 7th and San Julian at the LA Men's Project at the time, which is now Lamp Community.
Right.
And he had a little courtyard, and, he had this door where he would write the names of his friends on the door. Mr. Lopez and Mr. that, Miss this and all that. And when I went, I saw Mr. Gupta.
Oh, wow.
And I was like, oh man.
Wow.
I'm part of this man's family.
Wow.
And I think it was like my 22nd birthday. And Steve had gotten this giant sheet cake for me. And I'm standing across, from Nathaniel, who's playing and singing Happy Birthday to me, that morphs into an improvisation on a Schubert, that becomes Schumann, that becomes Beethoven. He just knew, like a savant, he knew all this music. Yeah. And I'm looking at the birthday candles, and on the other side of the birthday candles is a man in a tent. And here I am, a fat 22-year-old kid, blowing out candles, staring directly into the eyes of someone who I didn't offer a piece of that cake to.
Wow.
And it just stayed with me.
Wow.
That here's Nathaniel has an apartment. Right. Nathaniel got off the streets. How many more Nathaniels are out there? And
Too many.
And the question I was really asking, actually, was how many more VJs are out there?
Wow.
Because the truth is that, yes, talent is dime a dozen in Skid Row.
Yeah.
I have a social worker friend who says that Skid Row is the shadow side of Hollywood.
Wow.
On the Jungian,
I'm saying wow a lot, but that's a big one.
I know.
Because it's so true.
On the Jungian side, Hollywood is the glitz and the glamour and the pretend.
Right.
Skid Row is the shadow reality.
Wow.
It's the same delusion. It's the same performance, except Skid Row's real. So Skid Row is also the metaphor of our own devastated inner landscape. And Jung would tell us, in sterquilinis invenitur, in shit it shall be found.
I don't mean to laugh, but
in the shit,
right?
That's where you're going to find what you are least, the place where you're least willing to look is where you're going to find exactly what you need to find.
I had to fall all the way to homelessness for me to change. I was chasing money, chasing success like we're programmed.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until my own homelessness that in the shit that I was able to find a different path and find me.
And so in that way, a place like Skid Row is a deeply spiritual place. It's the crux. It's the crucible. It's the place where we have to melt ourselves down and be remade.
Yeah.
Right? And so in that crossroads, in that spiritual crossroads of Skid Row, of course people can see right through our bullshit.
It's interesting you said that, because for me, it's Hollywood Boulevard. But that's just because I slept homeless on Hollywood Boulevard. So when I walk Hollywood Boulevard, I see what I once was and what I became. And it's a very spiritual experience for me that I don't think anybody else could relate to.
Yeah.
It's all mine, deeply personal.
Yeah.
But I can see how that is the same for people in Skid Row.
Yeah.
That it's a spiritual experience.
100%. Well, I write about this in the book, and I was actually taught this story by someone who is a visual artist named J. Michael Walker.
Yeah.
And if you know the mosaic in Skid Row, it's on San Pedro Street outside the Weingart called I Am My Own Rainbow. Yeah. Have you seen that mosaic? It's gorgeous, and he's the one who created that, right? And it's an angel holding a rainbow. There's a street in Skid Row called San Julian Street.
Right.
San Julian, the story of San Julian is that it was kind of a story like Oedipus, right? He was the patron saint of people who build shelters.
Yeah.
And this was a complete accident that San Julian Street was platted by developers in LA and it became the center of Skid Row.
Yeah.
But it took me years to also realize that San Julian is the patron saint of violinists, right? And of fiddlers and of people who take care of the itinerant. Right?
Yeah.
And so it's this kind of thing too where what a metaphor that you slept on Hollywood Boulevard and this place where here we are kind of distracted by the delusions of our lives and yet have to keep our eyes on the next step. Yeah. Right? And so the truth is, you asked about how my transformation happened. I resisted my own transformation for years because I stayed in this mindset that I'm good. I'm fine. I'm the Philharmonic musician. And then I would see colleagues of mine in the LA Phil who I knew were drinking after rehearsals or popping pills before concerts would show up at a Skid Row event, or we started playing in the LA County jails, which is the revolving door between Skid Row and Twin Towers jail. Yeah. Right? Because our de facto treatment of mental illness in this country is incarceration. Yeah. Right? And I'll never forget, we had a cellist inside the LA County jail who ran out of the county jail room and then he told me in the parking lot, it's just full on flop sweat panic attack. He's like, dude, that place reminded me of rehab. Yeah. And I'd known this guy for 7 years. He'd never once talked about rehab. So it also made me realize that something was waking up in the musicians only in those places because those places were so honest. And it was only when, after my dad very suddenly passed away, but also after a number of people who I loved in Skid Row died of accidental overdoses, that I began to take my own addictions seriously. Yeah.
Well, you wrote a book.
I did.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, and this is kind of more of a personal question, personal question for me, because you obviously have mastered discipline. I mean, we all struggle at some level.
I wouldn't call myself a master, but
I mean, compared to me, like I said, this is a personal question for me. Yeah. That when I admire you mostly because of your heart and your spirit, also because of your talent. But I look at you and I see someone who has accomplished so much because they've mastered discipline.
Look, man, I've got my demons too.
Everybody does.
The thing for me is food was always the place of unconditional love, right? So I could stop practicing once my mom served dinner. Yeah. Dad would take me out for burgers and Cold Stone after a concert. So there's a part of me that's like, am I going to stop at the Burger King on the way back to LA or am I not?
Yeah.
That's where my mind is, right? So I use food. I'm an addict.
Yeah.
And I don't think I was addicted to alcohol, although I don't drink anymore, but I was certainly drinking 2 or 3 bottles of wine a night just to get through, right? Yeah. So I was using. The thing that I think we often mistake when we talk about discipline is that discipline is somehow punitive. And I think there's an important understanding in the relationship between the word discipline and disciple. Because there's also a positive side of discipline. What are you a disciple of?
Well, you have to commit, or I don't know if commit's the right word, but delayed gratification.
I'd go even further. I think it's bigger than commit. I think you have to make a promise to something bigger than yourself.
Okay.
Right? And I know from my friends in recovery that this is what we call the higher power.
Right.
Right? But in a sense, like for me, that's capital M music, right? Music for me is God. And so the truth is the violin is not the instrument. I'm the instrument.
Right.
Right. So I want to be a Stradivarius.
Right.
Of course, I want to play on one too.
Right.
But I want to become one.
Right.
And so what I'm inspired by in my discipline is the people who I rely on as my friends and my family in Skid Row, who are these unbelievable creators who are all in recovery.
Yeah.
They are all disciples of something bigger than themselves, right? So I have to credit recovery as a huge part of how I'm able to be disciplined. And part of how I started writing the book is I started this practice called morning pages, it comes from a teaching of Julia Cameron, who wrote a book called The Artist's Way. And there's a huge relationship in Julia Cameron's work between art making and recovery. Yeah. Because the whole point of recovering and the whole point of becoming disciplined is to re-author yourself, right? To literally write a new story of yourself into existence, right? So when this book started, people were first asking for a primer on how do I create a street symphony in my own community. Yeah. Right? So, here's how you start a 501c3. Here's who you write the grants. All the stupid bullshit of nonprofitese, right? And then I started, very much despite myself, to write a couple of true sentences. And Ernest Hemingway said, write one true sentence, write the truest sentence you know. And what's terrifying about writing the truest sentence you know is once you've written it down, you can't hide from it anymore. That truth starts to work on you.
Right.
That truth starts to see the part of you that you thought was invisible.
Yeah.
And once you bring it into consciousness, it's too late.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the rest of the book, the 6 years it took to complete writing this book, was just following the truth I'd never wanted to reveal about myself. So the book is deeply vulnerable. The book almost exists despite everything that screams at me saying, how on earth could you unveil that part of yourself? And that's what I also hope is that, this truism, the truth will set you free. It did set me free. Yeah. And I hope that it does that for others.
Street Symphony is an amazing nonprofit. You obviously wrote about it in the book. You said it was a primer as to how it started. You're at a level, because you have so much stardom, if you would. Don't know if that's the right word. Because of your career in music, that when you're trying to highlight Street Symphony, where you might overshadow it where you don't want to.
Right.
Like, I remember when Invisible People started, my personal story, I didn't want anybody to talk about. I wanted to talk about the homeless people, but all reporters wanted to talk about was me. Right. And I finally surrendered and said, okay, I'll play this game if it helps homeless people.
Yeah.
And that was a big struggle for me to say, okay, I'm going to step into the spotlight because I really don't have any other choice, because you're putting me on a pedestal.
Yeah.
You have to be at such a huge level where you have to wrestle with this.
Well, I mean, this is why I wrote the book the way I wrote it, which I hope is also a way of indicting myself. I really mean that.
Yeah.
Of naming the parts of myself that I was actively hiding, naming the parts of myself that I didn't want anyone else to see.
Yeah.
The fact that I would just sort of zone out during performances and dissociate and think about my post-concert in and out order.
Yeah.
You know, I would walk past mirrors and even windows and try not to look at my own reflection because I was so disgusted by the fact that I was 100 pounds heavier than I am now.
Right.
And so I was getting credit for all the wrong things. And people, of course, wanted to tell the story of the hero, the prodigy, the one who was solving all this stuff, right? But the reason I tell the story now is to invite people into their own transformation.
Yeah.
Street Symphony became the crucible of my own transformation. So in a way, it is an ownership of my own story. Yeah. But of course, on one hand, everything I make from the book is donated back to Street Symphony because it is my spiritual home.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I also hope that this allows people to see that if they want to do this kind of work where they are now, you don't have to be a MacArthur genius. Yeah. You don't have genius. You don't have to be an LA Phil violinist. You don't even have to have any kind of fame to do this work. The people who are doing this work the best are underpaid, overworked social workers who are people like you, Mark, who have recovered from homelessness and addiction and poverty, who are doing this work completely anonymously. Yeah. And it is my honor to be their accompanist. And their stories, the stories of Georgia Berkovich and Christopher Mack and Brian Palmer are told in this book.
Yeah. How do people get your book?
So the book is called Restrung. It is available wherever books are sold. I also did an audiobook version of it where I also record music. There's a whole sort of mini album that goes with the whole book. I was incredibly lucky to tell the stories of people who I've met in Skid Row, people who are my greatest mentors and teachers and friends. And this book is dedicated to the memory of my dad.
You talked about Brian Palmer.
Yeah,
who I have. We were in the NBC piece.
Dateline.
I totally forgot. Dateline. Oh my gosh. Let's get the leak going. So good thing we changed camera angles because all you people would see blood dripping down my face. Viral moments, right? You know?
Jesus Christ.
So
Brian.
Brian was a amazing person. He's featured in the NBC Dateline that I will link in the description.
Yeah.
Because you were featured and I was featured. Invisible People was featured. Great backstory behind that, by the way. I don't know if you know what happened. Is the executive producer was researching. And he said, no matter what he typed into Google, Invisible People came up. He says, you have the most extensive archive of homelessness I've ever seen. What's your story?
Yeah.
So I started telling him because, this is not shade on anybody because people have agendas or they need to raise money or whatever. So they tell the story of homelessness through their lens where I just want to prevent and solve homelessness. So I'm telling him what he hasn't heard before. And he's like, oh gosh, I've got to change the show and I've got to get you in it. But Brian, what was so amazing. So I was on a board of trustees for an international art program for homeless people. Wow. And we were having a convening in Manchester, London.
Yeah.
And Brian was there.
Yeah.
And it was the first time we met. And it was like, oh, I remember you because we were on this NBC thing. And then there was a woman in Venice. Do you remember when they're walking down 3rd and Rose with a NIMBY? And a woman came up and started, basically giving the NIMBY guy a hard time.
Yeah.
Well, I'm interviewing her, months later in Venice, and she says, we were on NBC together.
Wow.
I went, what?
Yeah.
No way. But Brian, such a sweet man, was finding purpose through music, singing, sadly passed away.
Yeah.
So if you want to know more, because we're running out of time and I'm leaking.
Yeah. But I will say, you know, just one thing is that there is no easy white picket fence American dream waiting for someone on the other side of homelessness.
Yeah.
There are many layers to Skid Row. There is the Skid Row that we happen to see on the street, what we call the encampment. But then there's also the tens of thousands of people who are receiving care inside the shelters and clinics.
Yeah.
And then there's the larger ecosystem of Skid Row, which is the Section 8, right, which is the housing, Skid Row Housing Trust, but also all the apartments, Star Apartments, all of these entities. So the thing is that just because someone is out of sight, people still need to be connected to a community.
Yeah.
And I was of this delusion that music could save Brian's life. Music is not going to solve homelessness. No. But as our friend Georgia Hawley says, music can provide someone with a moment of sweetness. And when they feel that sweetness, they can feel a moment of hope. And once a person feels hope, there's thousands of ways that they can act in their own self-agency, or they can connect with someone who can offer them help. Yeah. But the mistake that I made was thinking that if I got Brian on Dateline NBC, that he'd be okay. Right. And when Brian died of that accidental overdose, something shattered in me. Yeah. Because here I was trying to save everybody else and not doing the disciplined work on myself. Mm. And so in that way, Brian's death, like my father's death, was one of the greatest teachings of my entire life.
Well, life is a classroom.
There it is. My friend.
Thank you very much for spending time. Thank you very much for
my honor.
Putting up, because this almost didn't happen.
That's for you.
Thank you very much. Found a hat so that it could hide the gauze.
You had your med crew. Your
right. For those listening, go watch the video.
Or not.
For those watching the video, go listen to the podcast. Thank you for having the patience.
My pleasure.
And
it's great to see you, man.
Yeah, good to see you.
Thank you for everything that you and your team do at Invisible People. You're an inspiration to so many of us. I know, I want to just say this last thing. We talk about grants. We have to write grants and reports as nonprofits all the time. And I'll never forget the time that I was sitting next to somebody at, a Skid Row new building, and I was looking at the blueprints. And in the margin of this document, they had written 612 bodies, because that's how many people the building could house. But even the people working at the clinic were calling it bodies, right? So even in our language, we're so dehumanizing about how we talk about people. And we're constantly searching for these inane statistics, butts in seats, heads in beds, who's in the program, but we're not telling the stories. Yeah. And true transformation can only happen through narrative change and mutual narrative change. It's not enough for me to count how you've changed unless I'm in relation to you. Yeah. We're so willing to hold the sign, but we're not willing to talk to the person. Yeah. And I'm sorry, this is the soapbox and I'm on it, but I was going to say this, that protest is an amazing activity of civic engagement, but it cannot be our last activity of civic engagement, because everyone who protested George Floyd and Donald Trump and all the things that have happened in downtown Los Angeles walked over the body of someone sleeping on the street. Yeah. If we want to show up, if we want to actually enact justice in our world, go to Skid Row right now. Right now. You don't need to hold the sign. You need to talk to a person.